The fastest growing hardwood in North America is not pine. It is not Douglas fir. It is not any of the species that the U.S. timber industry manages, harvests, and replants on a rotation that generates $40 billion in annual revenue. It grows 20 feet in a single year. It reaches harvestable timber height in 7 years instead of the 40 that pine requires. Its wood does not burn. Direct flame contact produces surface charring and then stops because the moisture density of the living wood is too high for fire to penetrate. It resprouts from its root system after cutting, so the same tree produces multiple harvests from one planting. And it is illegal to plant in 11 American states because the timber industry that harvests the slower, more flammable trees convinced the USDA to classify it as invasive 40 years ago. Not because it threatened forests. It does not threaten forests. It grows faster than any forest species and produces timber before most forests have reached half their height. Not because it threatened wildlife. Japanese farmers have grown it alongside native species for 1,000 years without ecological disruption. Because it threatened the 40-year harvest cycle that the timber industry built its entire business model around. A tree that produces harvestable timber in 7 years, resprouts after cutting, and does not burn during wildfire season is not compatible with an industry that needs you to wait 40 years and pay for fire suppression infrastructure in the meantime. The wood that survived the fires of Edo, the wood that protected Japanese imperial records for 14 centuries, the wood that grows 20 feet in a year and resprouts after the chainsaw, the wood that chars and stops. The timber industry spent decades and millions ensuring it stayed classified as a weed. The wildfires have spent decades and billions proving that the trees replacing it are not a substitute. $7 billion per year. One tree that does not burn. The math has been available since 1923. Subscribe and hit the bell. The next story opens soon. In Japan, this tree has a name that translates to princess tree, Paulownia tomentosa. The Japanese call it kiri. It has been planted in Japan for over 1,000 years. When a Japanese girl was born, her family planted a kiri tree in the garden. When she married, the tree was cut. The wood was made into her wedding chest, a tansu, a storage chest built from kiri wood to hold her most valuable possessions. The reason families chose kiri wood for the most important chest in the household was not because it was decorative, it was because of what happened when the house burned down. Japanese cities burned regularly, wooden construction, dense urban neighborhoods. A single fire in Edo, what is now Tokyo, could destroy entire districts in an afternoon. Families knew their houses would likely burn at some point in their lifetimes, so they stored what mattered most in the one container that would survive. When fire reached a kiri wood chest, the outer surface would char. The charring formed a seal. The seal prevented oxygen from reaching the wood below the surface. Without oxygen, the fire could not continue. The chest did not burn. It sat in the ashes of the collapsed house with its contents intact. Silks, records, jewelry, everything the family had stored inside emerged from the fire undamaged. Japanese fire departments documented this property systematically after the 1923 Great Kanto earthquake, which triggered fires that destroyed 381,000 buildings in Tokyo and Yokohama. Kiri wood storage items were recovered from the ruins of burned structures across the city with their contents preserved. The wood charred on the surface and stopped. Everything inside survived. This property saved lives across Japanese history repeatedly. In 1657, the Meireki fire destroyed 2/3 of Edo and killed an estimated 100,000 people. Survivors who recovered kiri wood chests from the ruins found their contents undamaged. The wood that surrounded the ash fields did not contribute to the ash fields. In 1707, fires following the eruption of Mount Fuji swept through communities in Shizuoka Prefecture. Kiri wood structures at the edges of burned areas survived while pine and cedar burned completely. The Japanese imperial family adopted the Paulownia blossom as its official crest in the 7th century. It appears on the Japanese 500 yen coin. It is the official seal of the Japanese prime minister. A tree associated with imperial authority for 14 centuries, chosen not for its appearance, but for its properties. It grows fast enough to plant for a daughter and harvest for her wedding. It survives fire when everything around it burns. It gives back what it is cut from. The imperial family understood these properties before the science existed to explain them. The imperial family understood these properties before the science existed to explain them. This is not a folk property, this is chemistry. Paulownia wood contains between 70 and 80% moisture by weight when growing. Even after harvesting and drying, it retains significantly more moisture than other hardwood species. When heat is applied, the moisture in the wood converts to steam. The steam pushes outward through the wood grain, creating a vapor barrier between the heat source and the wood beneath. The surface chars. The steam prevents the fire from advancing. The wood does not ignite. A simple test documents this. Take a piece of dried Paulownia lumber. Hold a flame directly against the surface. The surface will blacken. Move the flame away after 60 seconds. The charring stops at the surface. no ongoing combustion, no ignition. Repeat with pine. The pine ignites within 30 seconds and continues burning after the flame is removed. This is the wood that America made illegal to plant. Paulownia grows 20 feet in its first year when established in suitable conditions. By year 3, it has reached heights that take pine 15 years to achieve. By year 7, it produces timber ready for harvest. The wood is lightweight, strong, and resistant to warping. It is used in Japan for musical instruments because its acoustic properties are superior to most other light hardwoods. It is used for furniture, cabinetry, and surfboards. Its strength-to-weight ratio exceeds that of balsa while being significantly more durable. After harvest, Paulownia does something that pine cannot do. It regrows. The root system survives cutting and sends up new shoots. Within 12 months of harvest, the tree is growing again. A single planting produces multiple harvests across decades without replanting costs, without seedling nurseries, without the reforestation programs that the timber industry charges the federal government for after clearing public land. One planting, perpetual harvest, fire-resistant timber ready in 7 years from a tree that survives wildfire while the surrounding pine forest burns. Now look at what California spends every year to suppress wildfires in its pine and fir forests. Before that number, one more piece of context. The timber industry does not just harvest timber. It sells fire suppression services. When a wildfire burns through a pine forest that a timber company manages under federal contract, the company receives federal money to clear the burned area and replant. The burned timber that survives the fire in salvageable condition is sold at reduced price. The land is then replanted with the same slow-growing flammable species under a new 40-year cycle. The wildfire does not end the business relationship between the timber company and the federal government. It renews it. A landscape of Paulownia that survives wildfire does not generate salvage revenue. It does not generate replanting contracts. It does not generate 40 more years of inventory management fees. The fire that is a disaster for a homeowner and a $7 billion public expense is a business event for the pine timber industry. The tree that survives the fire is a threat to that business event. Now look at what California spends every year to suppress wildfires in its pine and fir forests. $4 billion. The federal government contributes an additional $3 billion. $7 billion annually to fight fires in forests made of trees that ignite. The Camp Fire in 2018 destroyed 14,000 homes, killed 85 people, and caused $16.5 billion in damages. It burned through 153,000 acres in 17 days. The vegetation that burned was primarily pine, chaparral, and dry brush. Vegetation that ignites. Paulownia was growing in research plots 200 miles south of Paradise when the Camp Fire was burning. It was growing in experimental stands in North Carolina, Georgia, and Virginia. It was growing in nurseries and test plots run by researchers who understood what it was. And it was illegal to plant it on the private land that burned during those 17 days because the USDA classified it as a federal noxious weed in the 1990s after sustained lobbying pressure from the American timber industry. The noxious weed designation means that Paulownia cannot be transported across state lines for commercial purposes. It cannot be planted on federal land. In 11 states, it is illegal to plant on private land within city limits. The scientific basis given for the designation was that Paulownia spreads readily from seed and can colonize disturbed areas, outcompeting native vegetation. This is true. It is also true of pine. It is also true of Douglas fir. Timber companies plant thousands of acres of monoculture pine every year in land that previously supported diverse forest. The regulatory concern about monoculture spread did not appear until Paulownia threatened the pine harvest cycle. The timber industry's problem with Paulownia is simple arithmetic. Pine requires 40 years from planting to harvestable timber. During those 40 years, the timber company maintains the land, suppresses competing growth, manages the stands, and waits for the revenue. The 40-year cycle means the industry has 40 years of inventory in the ground at any given time. That inventory represents the company's asset base. A competitor species that delivers harvestable timber in 7 years and resprouts without replanting destroys the asset value of 40-year inventory. A fire-resistant species that survives wildfire while pine stands burn destroys the insurance model that pine timber requires. The industry had additional motivation, federal land management contracts. After clear-cutting federal forests, timber companies are required to fund reforestation programs. The contracts specify which species are planted. Those species are the same slow-growing pines and firs that produce the 40-year harvest cycle. If Paulownia were classified as acceptable reforestation material, the contracts would change. The fast-growing, fire-resistant alternative would colonize the cleared federal land that the industry currently replants with the slow, flammable species that justify continued harvest contracts. The regulatory framework that protects the pine industry was not built in one action. It was constructed grant by grant, classification by classification, over decades of sustained contact between timber lobbyists and USDA officials. The noxious weed designation was the final piece. Once classified as a noxious weed, Paulownia could not legally be introduced into federal land management programs, regardless of its fire resistance or timber efficiency. The regulatory wall was complete. The industry did not need to prove that Paulownia was dangerous to ecosystems. The definition of invasive is flexible enough to encompass almost any fast-spreading species. The lobbying worked, the USDA classification arrived, the regulations followed. Today, California spends $7 billion per year on fire suppression. The fire-resistant tree is illegal to plant in the burn zones. The connection between these two facts has not appeared in any congressional hearing on wildfire prevention since the regulations were enacted. Here is what Paulownia does in a wildfire scenario. The fire burns through the surrounding vegetation. The Paulownia stands char on the outer surface. The fire passes. The trees are still standing. Within the growing season following the fire, the root systems produce new growth. The stand recovers. The surrounding pine forest is gone and will not be replaced for 40 years. Japanese foresters have documented this behavior in accidental fire scenarios across multiple decades. Paulownia stands at the edges of burned areas, show consistent surface charring and survival. The root systems are unaffected by surface fire because of the moisture retention in the underground wood. The trees that burned their neighbors did not burn. The practical information for anyone who wants to grow Paulownia in states where it is legal. It grows from seed and from root cuttings. Bare root seedlings are available from specialty nurseries for approximately $2 to $4 each. Plant in full sun with good drainage. The tree is not particular about soil quality. It will grow in poor soil, compacted soil, and disturbed land. This is one of the characteristics the USDA cited as evidence of invasiveness. It is also the characteristic that makes it ideal for reforestation on land damaged by previous logging or wildfire. In the first year, water regularly during dry periods to establish the root system. After the first year, Paulownia is drought tolerant and requires no irrigation in most American climates. No fertilizer is needed after the first growing season. The tree fixes its own nutrients through deep root systems that access mineral layers beyond the reach of annual plants. For timber production, harvest at 7 years when the trunk diameter reaches 12 to 18 inches at breast height. Cut the tree at ground level, mark the stump. Within the following growing season, multiple shoots will emerge from the root system. Select the strongest shoot and remove the others. The fast-growing, fire-resistant alternative would colonize the cleared federal land that the industry currently replants with the slow, flammable species that justify continued harvest contracts. The regulatory framework that protects the pine industry was not built in one action. It was constructed grant by grant, classification by classification, over decades of sustained contact between timber lobbyists and USDA officials. The noxious weed designation was the final piece. Once classified as a noxious weed, Paulownia could not legally be introduced into federal land management programs, regardless of its fire resistance or timber efficiency. The regulatory wall was complete. The industry did not need to prove that Paulownia was dangerous to ecosystems. It needed to demonstrate that it was invasive. The definition of invasive is flexible enough to encompass almost any fast-spreading species. The lobbying worked, the USDA classification arrived, the regulations followed. Today, California spends $7 billion per year on fire suppression. The fire-resistant tree is illegal to plant in the burn zones. The connection between these two facts has not appeared in any congressional hearing on wildfire prevention since the regulations were enacted. Here is what Paulownia does in a wildfire scenario. The fire burns through the surrounding vegetation. The Paulownia stands char on the outer surface. The fire passes. The trees are still standing. Within the growing season following the fire, the root systems produce new growth. The stand recovers. The surrounding pine forest is gone and will not be replaced for 40 years. Japanese foresters have documented this behavior in accidental fire scenarios across multiple decades.